Hey folks, David Stewart here. Welcome to Writestream. I think we're on number 19. I need to find a little bit better microphone mount. It's always taking up the frame, putting the camera here. I kind of have to put the camera here because I don't want to shoot too much of the glass wall behind me. All right. So today, the moral of the story, we're talking a little bit about message fiction. So messages in fiction. Last week we talked about propaganda. Propaganda is designed to primarily to, improve the morale of the base or to demoralize an opponent, and then maybe over time to create opinions in people. All right, that's the purpose of propaganda. Message fiction can be propagandistic, but it's usually not propaganda specifically. It's not made by a state specifically to promote a different way of thinking by the state or to do those things that I talked about. Every piece of fiction has what I call a moral frame in it. What is a moral frame? A moral frame is just the way that it views the world and the way that it views right and wrong. And this is essential to creating a conflict in any story. Okay? The bad guys are bad because they want to do the wrong thing. The good guys are good because they want to do the right thing on a basic level. And we could play around with that a lot, right? The good guys could be good, but they have maybe the wrong idea for what's good, and they have to learn the right idea. You can have an anti-hero that has a different moral frame than other people, but is maybe trying to accomplish similar ends. Or an anti-hero that does bad things, but maybe is trying to redeem himself somehow, like the Thomas Covenant books. There's many different ways that moral frame is applied, but it's always going to have an effect on the story. You're always coming from a particular perspective about right, wrong, and the way the world works as well. This is why sometimes going back and reading the classics, like the Odyssey or the Aeneid or something like that, you're crossing not just a language barrier to ancient Greek or to classical Latin, but you're also crossing a really significant cultural barrier because the ancient pagans had a very different moral frame than the standard Western Christian moral frame, which whether you are a believer or not, you grew up and inherited and have probably completely internalized at this point in your life, right? You tend to view things through a Christian lens. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way, okay? So you tend to view things through a Christian lens. Give me just a second. I am going to make sure my camera is focused on me here real quick. There we go. All right. So I'm disappeared for a bit to get a little bit clearer in the frame. This happens when I shoot something and then forget to and I'm looking at a tiny preview. Okay. So yes, we're looking across time at a different way of viewing right, wrong, and the nature of the gods and things like that. And so if you're reading something the Odyssey, or you're reading Greek tragedy, for example, it may not be obvious to you all the moral frames that are in play because it'll be a little bit different. It'll be a little bit skewed for you. Versus Shakespeare is Christian and explicitly so. And even though it's post-Reformation in the English sense, it's really still a fairly Catholic moral frame. Okay. Same thing if you're reading something like Tolkien, right? What is right and what is wrong tends to be defined according to those the moral limitations, right? You notice that Aragorn acts according to very specific kinds of moral limitations, and so do Frodo and Sam. Notice they don't kill. Why don't they kill Gollum, right? And just murder him. It's they have a way of thinking that is going to prevent them from doing that because we want them to be virtuous and to do the correct thing. So with that in mind, keep in mind every story has some sort of moral message to it. Otherwise, there really wouldn't be a conflict. Otherwise, we're looking at conflict in a completely dry and neutral terms. Person A wants to win something and person B also wants to win that thing. What motivation does the audience have to care about person A or person B winning? It usually has to do with that moral frame. So if it's missing, then any kind of sympathy you have for the protagonist tends to disappear. I noticed this with a lot of modern, say like grimdark fantasy, which was very popular in the 2000s and even into the 2010s, where basically everybody's bad. You know, think of like Game of Thrones, right? One of the reasons that I think Game of Thrones runs out of steam after the first book is there's too much moral ambiguity. The moral frame is too fuzzy on the edges. In the first book, there is a moral frame. Like, we're approaching it with our moral frame, and so like Ned Stark is really a heroic sort of protagonist. He's like a good man in a sea of wickedness. And then after that, it just becomes various shades of wicked people doing various kinds of wicked things to each other, right? There's very, you know, maybe Jon Snow, but there's very little to root for, you know? So for me, that makes a boring book, to be honest, right? I think when I say it runs out of steam, I mean the story stops being interesting because there's no reason to care about the outcomes after that point in time. But there's grimdark fantasy that's like much worse than that, where you're like, I don't really know why anyone's doing anything or why I should care, and I hope that they fail, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Even something like Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which has a main character that's a rapist. He's a very bad guy, right? Very bad guy. You know, the whole point of the story is that he is unlikable, and he's, now I'm not going to say unredeemable, but he is, you know, a morally bad character who's sort of forced into doing good things and is fighting it in a lot of cases. He doesn't want to believe in the land, and then he gets, you know, basically forced to be the hero, if you want to put it that way. Somebody mentioned in the comments Steven Erikson. That's Malazan Book of the Fallen, right? So I like Malazan Book of the Fallen. I would call it epic fantasy. Is it grimdark? It can be, certainly at times, you know, especially if you're looking at a book such as Memories of Ice. Really all of them, right? The Chain of Dogs. Yeah, they're all fairly grimdark. What moral frame do we have there? Well, you'll notice that most of the characters you like Whiskey Jack and Fiddler and all those guys, they are trying to do something that is correct and something that is right. Even while being followers of Empress Lysine, you know, they're trying to do something that's correct. There is a strong moral frame, even though it's very grim. Same thing with Berserk. When people are like, oh, Berserk is nihilist, I'm like, I don't know if we read the same books. The whole point of Guts' character is that he is struggling to survive in a world that demands that he die. That he is in a Nietzschean sense, a Nietzschean Superman, attempting to create for himself his own, not his own morality, but his own reason for existence. And what he fights against is evil. And he's able to fight against evil not by being more evil in a sense, right? But really by being completely ruthless and relentless against that evil and never stopping, even at the expense of his own body and his own life, to overthrow it, right? It's easy to look at Berserk and see him chopping city guards to pieces and not realize, like, they're bad people. Like, he's cutting bad people in half. You get that really easily. So it's not, to me, it's not a nihilist sort of thing where there's there's an attempt to have no kind of moral reference. This even exists in Rick and Morty. Part of the gags is the fact that, you know, the writers know that we have this basic Christian moral frame, and Rick stepping outside of that can be hilarious or disturbing, and they use that effect, right? So they're aware of the frame. Morty represents the more like normal kind of person in that, and Rick is like, well, I'm the person that's outside of your petty morality, but he always ends up having to step back into that morality begrudgingly sometimes and do the right thing, right? Like turn himself into the bugs or whatever it's going to be, things like that. So there's always a moral frame. Some stories have a specific moral to teach. So the thumbnail has like the classic sour grapes in it. So if you haven't ever read Aesop's Fables, any kind of ancient set of morality plays is going to tell you something. It's going to tell you a specific message, right? A fable or a parable exists to teach you a moral story. So that is a particular kind of story, but all stories have some sort of moral to them in a way, right? And so I grabbed a bunch of my books as examples because I'm like, well, I definitely know what I intended with some of these. So this is one that a lot of people maybe didn't get the moral of the story, Demon Ex Machina. You can actually get this one for free, the ebook of it, if you join my mailing list, deviouspress.com/free-book. It's probably down in the description box on YouTube or whatever platform you're watching on. All my chat appears to be YouTube, which is normal, right? It's like 45,000 YouTube subscribers versus like 3,000 Twitter followers, right? It tends to be a little bit more weighted in the favor of YouTube, plus just a better video platform. Anyway, so what's the moral of this story, right? So there's always this question of like, is the demon living in the machine? And you get to the end. I don't want to spoil the ending, but here we go. You get to the end, and it doesn't tell you. I don't tell you. I think it doesn't tell you. I'm the one who wrote it, right? I'm telling you. I don't tell you explicitly whether there was a demon inside the computers. But it should be fairly obvious where the demon actually is. That the focus and the belief of the demon being in the computer is distracting the characters from the reality of the demons afflicting us. The demons are in and against people. They're not in a computer. This was an important moral point I wanted to make, I guess last year and the year before, dealing with AI, because people were like, AI is demonic, or there's demons in there influencing people with AI. And I'm like, I think that's more a reflection of us. So if it's fed on art from us, then it's going to feed on those. It's going to try to replicate those same demons to weird effects. But more, it's about us being willing to be open to demons, right? Demons are against us, not objects, right? A computer is an object. It doesn't feel, it doesn't think. Despite what you may have heard about AI, it's not intelligent in any kind of way that a human being would be intelligent, that is like conscious. Large language models are complex ways of doing computing. They're not, they're complex programs, right? They're not people. And therefore, right, like, they can't be possessed by, they can't invite a demon into themselves, nor can they be obsessed with demons, nor is a computer subject to temptation, right? Because it doesn't have a will of its own. It can't be tempted to do one thing or another thing, whereas we can be. And, that's one of the big things. And, if you talk to, especially any Catholic clergy, about sort of the demonic, there tends to be three modes that will get talked about: temptation, obsession, and possession. And people focus a lot on that possession thing. It's like in The Exorcist. And, the obsession thing, people should be more cautious about, right? If you turn into a frothing monster over a specific, say political issue, you might have some demonic obsession. That's what I think is probably more in play with most of the things. This person's demonically possessed. I'm like, I don't know about that, because they would probably be a madman, right? But the main one is temptation. Temptation is the main one that gets people, right? And so that's kind of the moral of the story with that one. Eyes on the Walls has a definite moral frame. And what's the moral of the story? What's it about, right? What's the message here? Well, the message is kind of about the loneliness of youth, the isolation, adults not believing people, but really about that you have to believe, right? You have to believe yourself. And if you believe yourself, that's when you're going to be able to protect yourself, right? This one has a fairly famous double ending that most people like. So if you haven't read this one and you want like a good horror read, it's fairly short. It's not a super long story, but it's good. I have lots of moral stories in Afterglow Generation Y, this book right here. Lots of things that might be considered parables. And in fact, if you have my collection, the Krampus Christmas collection, I think it's from 2020. So if you have that collection, there's a bunch of fables and parables in that collection. I have a collection of them. So yeah, what are some of the messages that are in this? Well, like if we use Mad Uncle Morty as an example, Mad Uncle Morty, I mean, is Rick and Morty, Mad Uncle Marty is basically about our generation's attachment to things. So if you fill your life with things, what happens to them when you have to go to the nursing home? Who are you when you go to the nursing home and all you can do is throw out quotes like we're back at the playground in the 1990s, like movie quotes? Like, who are you, right? So it's a sad look at a person who lacks a real identity because of his obsession with physical objects and collecting them. And maybe people will realize through that story that the current millennial obsession with collecting Funko Pops or something else like that is something that is temporary at best and unhealthy at worst, right? It's something that should pass because of its emptiness. Okay, there's lots of messages that are in there, and you'll get them multiple times because it's about all of the moral failings, the short-sightedness of my generation. So because it's about those things, it always has a message about what you should do and what you should avoid through those stories, right? Whether it's that one or it's it's Echo Box. Echo Box is really about the baby boomer obsession with television, and that you shouldn't allow too much input of other people's ideas, or you just stop thinking for yourself. Right? You need silence, along with other things. Things like that. Okay. Super chat from Campton Lab. Thank you so much. This is why I find writing historical fiction can be very challenging if you want it to be authentic. Morals can vary from time to place. They can. And they can vary according to time. They could vary according to the current religious views of the society. What are the morals of the French Revolution? That's an interesting one, because most of us would find them quite repugnant. Even if you're a modern atheist, you would find most of the morals of the French Revolution to be quite disgusting. The French Revolution's like where you get like 120 Days of Sodom comes out of that. Like just complete obsession with anti-morals. Not with like some sort of Nietzschean idea of like forging new morals and will to power. It was really just like, well, I'm going to write, but the Marquis de Sade is probably the most notable example, even though he was imprisoned for a lot of it, right? It was like, doing things that are anti-moral, writing stories about evil and coming at it from the frame that evil is not a thing, that's like an illusory thing, and we should do like I think 120 Days of Sodom, it starts with like these these aristocrats deciding that the only thing that matters is pleasure, and since evil gives more pleasure, we should do as much evil as possible. That's an interesting moral frame, right? And the result is something that's really hideous, and that's kind of the whole point of that. So yes, historical fiction can be very challenging, and I did that with Muramasa, right? There's a new version of Shogun coming out, I think. So I need to do some content on that to sell that book. It's kind of cool when you have like a big back catalog and just be like, oh, I want to sell Muramasa for a bit, so I'm going to do some content on ancient Japan, or not ancient Japan, on medieval Japan, katanas or something, and then we'll sell the book. People will watch it and go, oh, I totally do want to read a samurai book because there's so few of them out there to read. I'll read that one. So anyway, Shogun's coming out. When I wrote Muramasa, something that was very important to me, even though I don't view it as like a super accurate novel, people are always like, this is really accurate. I'm like, well, it's more accurate than like an anime, right? Or like most Hollywood kind of stuff, but that's not saying much. To me, it was still basically a fantasy novel because I mostly write fantasy and science fiction. But you wouldn't have characters that are libertarians. You wouldn't have characters that apply Christian morals to things very strictly. Rather, they would have morals that are derived from Buddhism and from Shinto, which have a little bit different moral frame. We're probably closer to Buddhism in the West. Like, Buddhism is easier to understand versus Shinto, which is really closer to ancient paganism, and ancient paganism is very alien to the modern mind because it's not about morality. It's about your relationship with the gods. And that's going to be important if you ever go back and read, the Odyssey, is that it's very much about the relationship with the gods, not about very specific ideas of right and wrong. So yes, that's an important one, I think, to know, is the historical nature of the changing frame, the changing world frame, that we have to acknowledge whenever we're writing something like that. I have other stories that I've written that have more explicit morals. One of them is called Garmish and the Farmer. This is a free book that I put out years ago that was actually completely within another book that I didn't ever release. But I really liked the fairy tale, so I pulled it out. It's a fairy tale in pretty standard format with like 3 different things that are going on. Who gets to marry the princess? There's 3 different competitors. They try 3 different strategies. Each task has a different alternate strategy that the farmer, like the underdog, ends up using to win. So like in one case, it's like move the heaviest stone, and there's 2 strong guys. They pick up heavy stones, and then the farmer moves his stone with a lever. Right? So he moves a stone so big no one can move it, and he does it with a lever and a pebble. So it's like, what's the point there? It's like, you didn't say I had to pick it up, you said I had to move it, so I used tools. I used my knowledge to defeat the problem versus using brute strength. There's another one where I'm trying to remember what he has to do for the second. Oh, he has to build the wall. Who can build the wall the fastest? So this is an endurance. This is like an endurance question and like a strength thing. So rather than doing what the other 2 guys do, which is grab the stones and run over and start stacking the stones as quickly as possible, he leaves, comes back with a wagon and a bunch of friends, and then they build. So he loses all this time going and getting a wagon and friends, and they load up the wagon, they go over to the wall, and then they build way more of the wall because he has friends that help him. And the friends aren't actually laying the stones. Like he says, you have to lay the stone. So he's the one who lays every stone, but his friends are the ones that do it. And then he has like the master wall builder tell him how to do it so that it comes out completely perfect. So not only does he build more of the wall than the other guys, his actually will stand and be perfect because he asked for help. So there's the other one, right? Are you going to do this by yourself, or are you going to humble yourself and ask for help and get a better result? And then the third one was like, you have to go slay this dragon. So he doesn't slay the dragon, right? He gets proof that he slayed the dragon by basically helping the dragon out and being friends with the dragon. So it's another kind of alternative thing there, right? So there's those sorts of fairy tale stories. Often the moral of a fairy tale is like really up in your face and really explicit. Thank you for the super chat, this Sound Engraver. I really do appreciate it. So anyway, there's a lot of like, very obvious lessons that you can learn there. So fairy tales tend to be pretty obvious with that. So do fables. The sour grapes is the fox can't reach the grapes. I don't know if foxes like grapes, but for the story, they like grapes. And he can't get the grapes, and he declares them to be sour. So what's that about? A thing which you can't have, you will decide it is bad for the sake of your own pride, I guess, your own ego. Those are probably sour grapes anyway, versus tasting the grapes, realizing they're sour, and walking away, which is how most people decide that they don't like something. It's like, why did you leave this job? It's like, it was a bad job. It's not like you didn't get the job. It was probably a bad job anyway. You can say that after you've had a job that was really similar. It's like, I'm glad I didn't get that job because I had this job, and so that job probably would have been really bad. That's not really sour grapes. That's like, oh, I'm extrapolating my experience. But sour grapes, you'd be like, oh, those grapes are probably sour anyway, right? So there's lots of little fables like that. Birds of a feather flock together. When the stork gets caught with the cranes who are eating the crops, he gets killed. Why? Because even though he's not a crane, he's with the cranes and looks like a crane, and therefore is probably just doing the same thing as the cranes, even though he declares he's different from the cranes, right? Birds of a feather flock together. So those are all moral stories. There's also what we call a didactic novel. This would be something like Atlas Shrugged, or Starship Troopers. Those are the two that come to mind. I've already done a bunch of content on Starship Troopers. It was like all over Twitter for whatever reason. It's like it does this every 2 years as people have arguments about it. Starship Troopers has a message about basically certain kinds of Republican values, like who should be, what kind of suffrage you should have in a republic and what kind you shouldn't. And the message is you can't have universal suffrage. Universal suffrage is bad, which is a basic Republican value, right? That's a value that this country was founded on. Universal suffrage is actually bad because not everyone has skin in the game and not everyone has the same skin in the game. So that's the message of the book. So when people call it a great book, they're usually talking about the message being great. They like that message. I have problems with the message, but I've talked about that in other pieces of content, so I don't need to rehash it. There's a lot of flaws with it. Basically, it's backwards from the way republics actually worked in the past, such as Rome. Like the idea that service guarantees citizenship is backwards from Rome. Rome was you had to be a citizen in order to serve, and there was very important reasons for that. You had to already have achieved suffrage through ownership of land before you got to serve in the legions. And that's to make sure that the army was not full of people who were not loyal to Rome. And in fact, the Republican system collapsed when it became necessary, running an empire and a large military conquering foreign lands, for the military to basically do what Heinlein is suggesting. Basically, the military becomes composed of non-citizens who gain their citizenship through being part of the legions. And that citizenship at that point is just a set of, it's not necessarily Republican suffrage, right? Unless you're out in one of the provinces and you might have it, but it's more certain privileges associated with the state, because at that point in time, all power had been concentrated in the emperor, right? The other thing about talking about is like, oh, we need to have a value like this. How are you going to do it, right? Like we already have universal suffrage, so you can't take away universal suffrage without some sort of military fatwa, right? You can't do it without a dictatorship. So there's not a whole lot of point in having long philosophical discussions about it. But half the book is just like Rico talking to a teacher about these ideas, and kind of a Socratic dialogue. That's actually one of the reasons I don't like the book as well, is that there's really not much story. It's really about the message, and if you are resonating with that message and are not critical to it and it appeals to you, then it's a great book. But if you're like me and you see that it's a little bit juvenile and not really going to be applicable to our society because it's not feasible, then you just waiting for a story to happen and it doesn't happen, right? Atlas Shrugged is another one. You have these long speeches by John Galt and other characters, right, about this or that and the other. Really, they're philosophy lectures delivered in the middle of a book, intended to educate you on Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy, what she called objectivism. So it's a didactic novel. And that's also, by the way, what makes Atlas Shrugged a pretty good novel, is that it's about the philosophy. I actually like it better than Starship Troopers because there is more of a story. There's an actual plot. There's actual characters in conflict with the state and with each other and things like that. I find it a much more interesting read for that reason. It's a much longer read, and to be honest, if you are not into objectivism or you hate it, then it's going to be a really painful read. Much more painful than Starship Troopers, because you're going to have to endure many speeches that you don't like. And I guess this brings up a bigger question, which is like, do readers like to be preached at? I think most of the time they don't. They'd rather have the moral of the story be part of the conflict and the plot and the characters and their relationships than to have characters pause and give speeches about abstract philosophical ideas or political ideas in the middle of a book. Now, I say that, and I give you two super popular examples of books that don't do that. But I think one of the reasons that people, for instance, don't like modern Marvel movies is they're injected with messages that are just not resonating with the audience. And not only they're not resonating with the audience, that's a fiction form that usually doesn't have those messages associated with it. So what tends to happen is there's a moral frame towards like Marvel stories from the 60s with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and those guys, John Buscema and all the rest. And then that frame gets, they're trying to tug the frame over, right? Like they're changing the moral frame of the stories so that it's more leftist. And then the rather centrist audience says, wait a minute, this wasn't political before. Well, it was not explicitly political because it just existed within the normal moral frame of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So it's only when you kind of pick it up in the modern times and you try to bump that frame over, it's like it's obviously political because the frame, the moral frame is inherently political now, right? The moral frame of the left is a moral frame. It's not just ideas about like stuff. It's not asking like what's the optimal way to do things. It's like you're bad and are bad and should be punished, right? It's a moral thing. So you can only defeat a moral vision with a higher moral vision. My friend Brian Niemeyer that I've had on the show has made that point, and I've made this point. Like, take your, it's the eagle and the snake. The eagle is stupid to fight the snake on the ground where the snake is powerful. The great eagle grabs the snake and takes the snake to the sky where the snake is powerless and kills it in the sky, right? So take your arguments to the spiritual realm. That's my point there. Anyway, so yes, we interpret it as political because it's kind of like what Carl Schmitt says in The Concept of the Political. If you've never read that, well, it should be on your reading list at some point, as well as The Prince by Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli, friend of the bourgeois, in some capacity, right? So if you read The Concept of the Political, within the total state, culture and politics intersect each other, at which point the culture is subject to the politics. In other words, the state is going to view itself as having a mandate to change culture, and that everything is within its sphere of operation because it's a total state, including cultural items, right? So at that point in time, once you start to shift the moral frame over, it becomes obviously political because that's the whole point of changing the moral frame, is it's a political change of morals. So when people pick up on that kind of message fiction and don't like it, they're not liking the shifting moral frame. They don't like the moral frame shifting from the normal moral frame that we all grew up with and we all understand with basic concepts of right and wrong that we can all agree on, into a moral frame that is about Marxist revolution, right? And there's nothing wrong with having that objection. That's an appropriate objection to something like that, because we're changing the moral frame of the original stories and changing the authorial intent of what was going on with those Marvel stories. And more than that, it ceases to be fun. Once we step out of the normal moral frame, the stories start to become heavy-handed and preachy, and they're not fun to watch anymore. At first, I didn't think I'd write stories based on my reaction to things, but if it's a good enough conflict, I think it can work. By reaction to things, I mean political or general controversy. Yeah, I wouldn't say like anything in my books is like specifically political, like, we should change this policy, right? It's only political in that Carl Schmitt sense of like the greater culture defining a moral frame, which then defines like what's necessary or possible politically. But that's pretty general. Like, Eyes on the Walls, it's a Christian horror novel, right? All horror really adopts a Christian frame, if it's effective. Even Stephen King, and I don't know if he would admit that, but all of his books tend to actually have a moral frame of a, Christianity, which is the standard moral frame of the West. Okay. Now that can vary a little bit, right? There's, people who are Catholic are going to have just a slightly different understanding of things than somebody who's Protestant, but it's going to be generally the same. It might be a little bit different once you start to get out of that into like, Muslims or things like that. And then Buddhism is further away. And then if you're getting to somebody who's part of a folk religion, they may have a completely different frame of what's moral and what's not. It's like reading tales of them, of like explorers coming across Aborigines, like Australian Aborigines, who like would kill and eat like every other child because of we're sitting there like, that's horrific. Or you come across the Aztecs and they're bringing the children up to be sacrificed to Xipi-Totec or whoever, and they believe that the more the children cry, the better they are. So they're like torturing the children. They rip their hearts out. They skin them alive. Or they have things where like they're going to celebrate Shipiatotek. So they grab a victim, they skin him alive and rip his heart out. Then you wear the dead skin around. You wrap the skin. The warriors will wrap the bloody skin around and go out like panhandling. It was like one of the things that they would do. So we see things like this and we're like, well, that's pretty horrific. That basic moral understanding of things, that moral frame that we're looking at there, we can only really have that if we have a Christian moral frame, because they are operating on something that's much more pagan. It's about the relationship with the gods. It's not about right or wrong. They don't, their right or wrong has to do with whether or not you're doing something for the gods, because the gods, if you don't sacrifice to Shipiatotek, you're not going to get any rain or crops and everybody's going to die. So you have to be on the right side of the gods. So their entire moral frame is about appeasing the gods, just like it was with the Greeks and the Romans in ancient days. And that also included really horrific child sacrifice, human sacrifice of an absolutely abominable scale. So one of the reasons that the Aztecs were overthrown so quickly and easily by like one or two ships of Spaniards was all the tribes that were being ruled by the Aztecs in the Aztec Empire hated them so much they immediately switched sides to Europeans and helped them out, right? So it wasn't just the Spanish, it was everyone else hated the Aztecs because of how incredibly horrific they are and their flower wars and all that kind of evil stuff they did. So yeah, it was like an evil empire. And so our moral frame, we can look at it and be like, okay, they are an evil empire. If you're going to write something with Aztecs, being able to establish a moral frame that's going to make sure they're bad guys is going to be important in a work of fiction. It's going to be really hard to make them good guys, because the reader has his moral frame too. And while he might be able to step out of himself and kind of understand why you had these priests ripping hearts out of people because they were terrified of demon gods, he's not going to accept that as like a good thing, because there's no realm in which he would send his children off to have their hearts ripped out and their skins flayed open and their flesh devoured and their skull put on their head put on some little display, right? So a normal person will never have that moral frame, but that's okay. It's not going to happen. We also have this thing a little bit when we're looking at Old Testament stuff, is like people in the Old Testament have like some very different ideas. Like you read the book of Judges, is like there was no king over Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and people do like really horrible things. And it's easy to look at that book and be like, well, these God's chosen people are being really bad. It's like, this is setting you up. You understand where Saul comes from and the need to establish an Israeli kingdom of Israel, and later Israel and Judea, right? Maybe you get that, maybe you don't. Okay, so lots of my stuff has moral stories, and every book or story with conflict is at least inheriting some sort of moral frame of right and wrong that's going to make you invested in the conflict and care about the characters. As far as having messages about specific things that are right or wrong, most stories have that kind of built in, but it's not like in the front. It tends to just be a part of the story, right? Like it's wrong to maybe it's a story of revenge. The guy gets revenge, and you could probably guess what happens is that he doesn't feel satisfied by the revenge. So there's a moral story there about like the revenge doesn't bring you peace. It doesn't bring back dead loved ones or things like that. Other stories might say like the revenge is totally justified, and they'll have that as a conclusion. So even something like revenge, which is a really good motivation, can have multiple different morals to it depending on how you frame the ending. As a writer, you can have a lot of different things that come out of that. And in some cases, the reader or the audience will reject something that's like, if you try to make some kind of point about revenge bad, people will be like, well, no, this person that you were going to kill is actually bad and deserves to be killed. They're bringing a moral into it, right? You get the idea. What do you think about the Punisher? I haven't interacted with the Punisher in a long time, but I liked the Punisher as a kid a lot for that reason, is that like he's just doing bad things to bad people. That's what we'd like to see. That's what vigilantism is all about, right? Moral framing is so well explored in old school science fiction. The human race, however fallible, is more upright than the barbaric alien races. Yeah, if we're going like pulp era. But the moral frame is very much explored in, say, post-World War II science fiction. Stuff like Philip K. Dick, that's always an obsession of his. Like if you read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which spawned Blade Runner, it's very different from the Blade Runner movie. I think it's totally worth reading. There's this whole like religion based on having empathy, based on having feelings, about what it means to be human is like having feelings. It's a very different approach. Like you see that android test in the movie, that's really seeing if somebody has sort of some empathy for an animal, right? If you can have empathy for an animal, then that's, there's like a religious thing associated with it. So it's really interesting. A lot of classic sci-fi has moral questions about that kind of stuff. And when we introduce technology, we have a moral question of whether that technology is right or wrong to use. Occasionally, a series like Star Trek will explore that. But more often than not, you're going to have just adventures in something like Star Trek. Or Star Trek's they're going to encounter an alien race that has a different moral view, and they have to figure out what that means. So there's one where they encounter an alien race that anytime somebody breaks the law, they're immediately executed. Okay, it produced this completely peaceful society. Like they show it as a utopia. Completely peaceful society that just has like free sex with each other. It's somebody's idea of utopia. And I think it's Will Wheaton's character, the Wesley Crusher. He like steps on a plant and then they're going to kill him. And so they have to step in and be like, wait a minute. This can't be justice, right? We have our idea of justice that is the punishment fits the crime. So if he smushed the plant, then he should fix the plant or pay to replace the plant. That would be normal human justice, right? Oh, I broke your plant. Fix the plant. Pay for the plant. That's the justice. Instead, it's like, no, we're going to kill him. That's our justice. So you have to, Picard and company kind of have to deal with that. And then there's a kind of a Deus Ex Machina thing. There's a godlike being protecting the planet that's not going to let them just come in and use their technology to enforce their justice. They have to try to convince the people that it's not right to do that in that case, right? And they had a lot of stuff on their side. We didn't know that this was the actual way that your justice system worked. We may not have ever visited on the off chance that something like this would happen, that somebody would unintentionally, in this case, he didn't intentionally break the law. He unintentionally stepped on a plant while playing with other kids. Right? So there's all this stuff that's like, here's all these things for why this universal death law shouldn't apply. I have to convince these people of it, and this godlike being will stop me from just enforcing my power upon them. Because with my ship, my mighty Enterprise ship, I could just blast them into oblivion or teleport us straight off the planet. No problem. So there's a lot of, questions with an episode like that. I don't remember the exact name of the episode. It's like season 1, season 2, maybe. Anyway, it's a lot of good stuff like that. A lot of questions in Philip K. Dick stories that I really liked. Of course, he was the one who wrote Minority Report, and I don't know, there's 20 other ones that I could probably name if I thought hard about them. So yeah, there's a lot of those moral questions. What's the moral of the story, right? What's he trying to ask you to consider about right and wrong? A lot of stuff like Robert Heinlein, going back to him, the nobody ever talks about any book he wrote besides Starship Troopers. I don't know why that is. But if you're looking for like good stories, there's something like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is kind of funny and has some irony to it with things. But you create like through speculative fiction, you can create like a world where it has certain limitations, and how do people respond to them? So I think it's Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It's been a while. Basically, there's polygamy, but it's because there's an excess of men. It's like multiple men married to one woman in order to like distribute sex. It's like that's just how it worked out. It's how people worked it out on the moon. But they're also ruled by like a supercomputer, so it's weird. There's A Stranger in a Strange Land is all about moral framing. That's another Robert Heinlein book. It's a guy's raised, I think it's on Mars. I need to go back and read a couple of these, but he he's a human, and then he comes back into human society, and he has a completely different view about sex, about marriage, right, wrong, property. All his morals are different than regular standard human morals. And so it's the moral question there is like, can you justify the human morals absent some other like evocation such as God? And there's a lot of questions there. Oh, a super chat. Thank you so much from Elijah Tiemans, or Tiemans. Can bad morals be compatible with good storytelling? I endlessly hear YouTube critics of modern storytelling say we just want good writing, but are non-committal on values. It depends on the values of the audience. That's really important. Okay, so if it's morals that we interpret as bad, can you do good storytelling with them? You can, but you have to be very careful about how you're doing it, right? So I use Thomas Covenant as an example. He's a very contemptible main character. And so one of the questions there is, can a really bad person, and he's bad, people's current idea of anti-heroes, I'll probably publish an article about this, maybe this week, next week, and we could talk about it on the show next week. Heroes and anti-heroes and villains. What's the difference between them? Nowadays, we tend to think of heroes as just a protagonist and he's doing the right thing. And we tend to think of villains as bad guys who do bad things. But that's not the origin of the words or their function in stories from ages past. So a villain was a more broadly bad person. Villain actually means like peasant. So the villain of a story is not a person who is evil. He's a person who is bad. He's a low status, a person with low virtue, with low fiber, low self-control. He'll have bad things about him, not just do bad things, not just believe in bad things, right? Like a person who is extremely self-controlled and uses that self-control to conquer the world brutally. It's a different moral story than a villain who like is full of covetous feelings and covets his neighbor's wife and is petty and resentful. That's a villain in a classical sense. Like think of like Merchant of Venice, Shylock. Like that's a classic villain. Like somebody who's like morally decayed, not just morally decayed, but like low virtue, greedy. Not just I think that it's okay to kill babies. It's more like I want the money and I'm jealous that you have it and I'll do anything to get it and to harm you. That's a villain, right? So you have an anti-hero like Thomas Covenant. Can somebody who has done something really bad be able to help people and do good? That's the question of like the first Thomas Covenant book, because what happens is he thinks he's having a dream and he rapes this 16-year-old girl, or really early in the book, and it's a very like surprising and vicious event that happens in this book, and it actually has a massive impact throughout at least the rest of the first trilogy, but really the whole thing, which is he's the hero and he's bad, and he's a classic villain. He's petty, he's resentful, he's a leper, he's full of self-hatred. He doesn't believe in the land. He doesn't believe in saving it. He doesn't believe in anything. But he's through the sort of machinations. Machinations? What am I saying? The machinations of the story, of the plot itself and the other characters. He ends up being the hero. In other words, he ends up doing the right thing and helping people. By the way, like the classical version of a hero is something more like Perseus or Hercules or Beowulf, and not just somebody who's the protagonist. The protagonist is a kind of a story function. A hero is something different. Conan is in the classic vein of heroes. He's a demigod. He's stronger and better than other people, and therefore his contests are of a higher value. He's fighting monsters, not just other men, but monsters. And that's important. That's a classic hero. When we say hero, we're really meaning like protagonist. But in this case of Thomas Covenant, is like, can he do heroic things? He saves people with magic and things like that. Can he do heroic things while being a weak, petty, resentful, self-loathing author, right? And if we kind of look at it as like a meta thing, what is Stephen R. Donaldson really saying? It's sort of like about himself and about authors and writers and just this. The world is the creation of a creator. an author. And the author is going to force the characters to do what he wills them to do, whether they want to or not. And he can push them through a heroic story even if they are vicious and evil beings. So it's very interesting. I think they're very underrated books by modern audiences who are wanting, something that's a little more, good guys against bad guys. They're very influential books. I think they're really well written. I think Stephen R. Donaldson does a great job with those, and I think they're worth reading. You have to step outside of your normal desires of, I want Dragonlance Part 22. If you want Dragonlance Part 22, there's lots of Dragonlance novels, and there's lots of books that are like Dragonlance that you can read. That Thomas Covenant is completely different from those. Same thing, it's like, I want Sanderson. Great, read stuff that's like Sanderson. That's not Thomas Covenant. You'll be uncomfortable with the character, and that's the point. So bad morals can be, but it really depends how you do it. It all comes down to execution. So with Stephen R. Donaldson, the bad morals, that's kind of the point of the story, is the pathetic and bad villain-like character being forced to be a hero almost against his own will. Right. If you have something like The Golden Compass, which has, an attempt at like atheist allegory, maybe. I'll leave that up to you. I think you have to have some sort of moral frame for the audience to be invested in the conflict. And that means that the moral frame needs to be somewhat similar to the audience's, which means it basically needs to be, the sort of general moral frame that we've adopted in the modern West, if you're writing for a Western audience, and not some other kind of bad morals sort of thing. If you have a bunch of bad, but I say that, but people really like Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is really about bad people doing bad things. And I'm not going to go so far as to say it's a good story, but people think that it's well written. What's another one? The Sopranos, or a mob story. Right, like The Sopranos is about bad people doing bad things, and it's well written. So I think you can do it. I absolutely think you can do it, but I think it's about how you frame it. It's like we have to have some reason for wanting Tony Soprano to survive and to thrive. And the reason that we are given in the first Sopranos episode is the ducks, right? The ducks are really important. They're a save the cat moment. By putting that save the cat moment in there where he loves the ducks in his pool, it humanizes him and gives us this big store of humanity and care for the character that really can go all the way through the end of the story in a lot of different ways. But Tony also has certain kinds of morals that exist once we get along, loyalty versus, they're just not like killing is bad, right? This is a basic mob story stuff. If you watch something like Godfather, it's easy to think that The Godfather is similar to The Sopranos, where it's about bad people doing bad things. And it is, but it's about how doing those bad things turns you into a bad person. So if you watch the first Godfather movie, by the end of the first movie, Michael Corleone has turned into the Godfather. And this was a transition from a guy who wanted to be straight. He wanted to be moral and good. And through those experiences, having his wife murdered, right? Of course, this was like, he fell in love when he was in Sicily, and then his wife was murdered through vendetta and stuff like that. All the way to murdering a police officer by shooting him in the face in order to help the family. He transitioned from a character that had morals to one who was just evil. To where his morals were, it's all about the family. Never go against the family. And then in the second movie, his wife aborts his babies. His wife kills his baby, or aborts it. And her doing that was super significant because she hated him so much that she was going to kill his child because he was so evil. And that's like and now the filmmaker might have an opinion on abortion, but that has a huge impact, whether you think people should have abortions or not have abortions. That moment in it is like, it's profound. it's come back around where he didn't conceive of someone being able to do something so bad to him. Like his father losing his son, he has lost the son because of his own hubris. It's a very deep, tragic ending. Godfather 2. Star Trek episode with the plant. Season 1, episode 8, Justice. That's it. Yes. I don't remember the name of every episode. I've watched... So, there's only one Star Trek thing I haven't watched. Two. Star Trek Discovery. I've not watched a single episode. And I didn't watch the third Star Trek reboot movie. Even though I heard it was okay. I'm out. I'm not doing Star Trek anymore. Yeah, most of the Marvel characters aren't heroes by the classical definition. I disagree. Most Marvel heroes are heroes by the classical definition. But I think you might... I think we're probably disagreeing on the classical definition. They're superhumans. Like Hercules. Hercules is a hero. Perseus is a hero. Marvel heroes are superheroes. That's why they're superheroes. They're basically gods. And their conflicts are with monsters, supervillains. So they are an extension of the classical view of heroes, in my opinion. But I think that I think superheroes to me are boring. They just have gotten boring. So that's it. Super chat from Captain Lamp. Thank you. Beowulf is far from what modern audiences would consider a hero. The idea of a hero was quite different in the 5th century. I agree. Do you think modern readers are unaware of the definition of hero can shift? I think they are, and that's okay. That's why I like to do educational content on this kind of stuff. And that's why I'll probably write a hero about sort of the classic definition and how we usually think of hero as a protagonist, a morally correct protagonist. Like, is Luke Skywalker, he's the hero of Star Wars. Now, he starts as a boy and he becomes a hero. That's kind of the hero's journey thing, right? He becomes sort of empowered by the gods. That's what the Force is. The Force is the force of the gods, right? So he becomes empowered by the gods, just like Heracles or Perseus or even Aeneas, depending on how you want to look at it. He becomes something more than a man. And that is a classical hero. Stephen R. Donaldson writes Thomas Covenant as a hero, but an anti-hero. He's a hero. He's empowered by the gods with his magical white gold ring. But he doesn't have the normal qualities of a classic hero. That is, he's not brave. He's not bold. He's not trying to achieve greatness. He's not seeking out challenges. He's not acting passionately. Samson is a hero in the classic vein in the Bible. So, Samson does all these weird things. Like he loses a bet and he goes and kills 20 of their family members to give them their clothes. It's like, yeah, you're looking at it through a modern moral frame and not the frame Samson was in, nor what that piece of the Judges was really about. Right? That's okay. We just have a different view. So yeah, people would find it kind of weird to look at Beowulf, for example. They'd be like, wait, this is a hero, right? Or you read a lot of the Norse myths are heroic in their tone. Like Thor is a god, but he's like a hero. He does these heroic things. He goes fishing and catches Jormungandr, the world serpent. And then the host, the guy who put him up for the night, falls in the water, and he's like, that'll learn him not to go fishing with Thor. It's like Thor is kind of a bad guy. It's like, they didn't think of it that way. The myths are about Thor being powerful, not about Thor being good. They did human sacrifices to Odin by hanging people. Why? Because Odin might like that. And we want Odin on our side. Totally different mindset, the pagan mindset is, from the modern Christian mindset, where I'll receive reward and punishment based on the things I do. I mean, even Buddhism will have that, right? But paganism, it's like, no, the things that you do or don't do, that's a different sort of philosophy that defines those things. The Platonists, Aristotelian ethics, and stoicism and that kind of stuff. It's a philosophical question, whereas what's really important is that you keep the gods on the side of Rome because we don't want Rome to fall. Julius Caesar would probably not say his best qualities was that he was a great commander or general, but rather that the gods favored him. He knew how to get the gods on his side. He was very, very pious. So yeah, I think modern readers are very unaware of it, and we just don't teach it in schools anymore. It was taught very poorly when I was in school. If at all, it was barely touched. The only time I learned about it at all was in kind of elementary school gate education, and we never visited it again until I was at the university level, what a hero is. And these are like the foundational literary works of our entire society in the West, are things like the Odyssey. And teachers just didn't understand them. That's okay. They didn't have a great education either, maybe. Or they just chose not to think about them on this level, right? We briefly talked about the Odyssey in a high school class, and I didn't understand it at all until I took like a classics course from, which one? It was either Bruce Thornton or Victor Davis Hanson when I was at Fresno State. I think it was Bruce. It was Bruce's class. It was one of the first classes I took, and it just like blew me away because I didn't understand anything about the classics I had read. Right? They were like this foreign, weird thing to me. I just didn't understand the Odyssey. And I was like, oh yeah, this is about how they're eating at the wrong time. Oh, man, I never even thought that would be important. Yeah, that's really important to ancient people. That's why they have rituals around eating and how you do sacrifices and how you eat sacrificial meats. They're really important. Oh, well, because it's not important to modern people. Like, I'm hungry, I'll go get some Pop-Tarts out of the pantry. It's like, no, it didn't work that way for ancient people. American Beauty had bad characters in it, if I recall. I didn't fancy it, but I think it was popular. It was popular, and I thought the characters were bad, and I thought the messages were bad, and I thought it was creepy and gross, and I didn't like it. But other people liked it. So, yes, you can have maybe you can have bad characters with good storytelling, and people will still like it. Just because I don't like something doesn't mean that you can't write something that you could write something that I would dislike and it could still be popular and other people will like it. Just because I think it sucks doesn't mean that you can't make money on it. Do you think JRPG's usual spiels about fighting organized religions, killing God, not holding villains accountable for their actions, protagonists espousing empty platitudes about the power of friendship in the face of nothingness, etc., is reflective of Japan's cultural values and moral framework? It might be. I'm not a super expert on Japanese culture to make a big hand waving kind of thing there. I think that they find it interesting, though. I think maybe it comes from their own traditions of intrigue in the shogunate, in the various shogunate eras, because a lot of their literature, going all the way back to maybe even the Heian period. I'm trying to remember the work. Deals with a lot of these hidden corruption underneath the surface sort of things. So that might be from that. It's also just kind of interesting. It's like, what if things are not as they seem? That's like every Final Fantasy plot ever. And I actually like that. I think that's a great way to format a plot. Is like there's a way that we accept things are, and then maybe there's a nefarious force making it that way, and we have to uncover the mystery and then dig out the wart. You have to fix it. You have to fix it. So yeah, one of the best Final Fantasy stories is Final Fantasy IV, about a villain who becomes redeemed. That is Cecil, and to an extent, Cain, his friend Cain, the dragoon. Right, but it's about their redemption, their moral redemption from being evil and serving Golbez and doing bad things to becoming the heroes of the story. I really wish you watched or read Attack on Titan. I watched the first couple episodes, and the dub was only available, and it was so bad I couldn't go on. And I thought everything about it was so slow paced and cringed, I couldn't continue. I'd really love to hear your view on the main character Aaron's morality at the end of the series. It was pretty divisive online. Yeah, maybe someday. I don't have hours and hours and hours to watch an entire anime series. Maybe I could put it on, put the dub on while I'm working out and lifting. But for anime, it's I kind of like to see the visuals, and if it's a manga, I like to read it. But mangas can be really expensive to collect. You know how it is, right? I have to kind of make decisions about things that I'm putting on my shelf. All my shelves are completely full everywhere in this house. Even I have a bunch of bookshelves in the living room, but they're full of my wife's like trinkets, her collections. They don't have books, so I don't have any room for more books. I have to really if I'm buying any more books now, I have to get rid of books at this point. Speaking of the French Revolution, what do you think of the Scarlet Pimpernel? Reading it was my first exposure to the French Revolution. If I read it, I don't remember it. You know, there's plenty of classic things I haven't read. Somebody said like the French Revolution was like Bolshevism on steroids. Yeah, they used to like do horrible things like murder nuns, like just abysmal things. Same thing with the Spanish Civil War. Go out of the way to torture nuns. I know that friendship plays such a big part in shonen's popularity because their society is so closed off socially. It's like idealization for them. People in Japan have friends though. I think sometimes if, I don't know, befriend a Japanese person and you can get an idea. People in Japan still have friends and they have like a foodie culture. They go out and eat all the time. So people in Japan still have friends. It's probably more face to face. It's probably more of a face to face culture than American culture is now, for young people at least. We got to be real. But I think shonen's popular because it appeals to young people. That's why it appeals to Western young people as well. It doesn't just appeal to Japanese people. I think that may be a universal appeal, is the power of friendship. Japanese people are just obsessed with sort of cargo cult Western philosophy, where they love to reference Western philosophy, but in a relatively shallow way. I hear that a lot. Westaboos are a thing there as well. Like we have weebs that are just super into like whatever pop cult stuff from Japan comes out. They have the opposite. They have Westaboos. They have people that like are obsessed with Western stuff. Like they're super into Metallica and King of the Hill, or whatever it's going to be. They're really into that kind of stuff. In a lot of anime and manga, it's still more sophisticated than most Western pop media, but it's kind of goofy if you've actually read philosophy. Yeah, but again, the point is it's really not worse than Western media. Remember, they spent a whole bunch of time in Infinity War trying to justify what Thanos is doing based on Malthusian grounds, which they never even understood to begin with. They never understood Thomas Robert Malthus's theses or why it was bad. If they understood it, then they might have understood why it was just a big phony baloney IYI garbage. But they didn't really understand or think about it too much. That's like, Thanos is going to kill half the universe to preserve life. I'm like, you just kicked the can down the road 30 years. Right? If we wiped out half the people on Earth, it's like, great, we went back to 1960 levels. But we still have all the infrastructure. We're going to grow back to 7 billion even faster than we got there. And then this is a cool, weird thing to think about. Like they bring everybody back 5 years later. Do you understand how horrific that would be? This would be the biggest, most horrific, most disgusting disaster that ever happened. Was bringing 3.5 billion people back to life 5 years later. Why? Because in 5 years, you haven't grown food for those people. You have a starvation event. Right? People have moved on and gotten remarried, had new children. Right? Companies have shut down. There's no jobs. There's no work. The economy has scaled back to being done by and for 3.5 billion people. Bringing people back to life would be the worst. That would create so much suffering. It's almost unimaginable. If you added 7 billion people, just added 7 billion people to the world today, that actually would be worse than adding 3.5 billion, because the roads were built for 6 or 7 billion people, right? So there you go. Yeah, the dub on the Attack on Titan is awful. It's like so bad. I just couldn't stand hearing their voices, so I didn't continue. This was years ago though, so that's just take it for what it is. It's like sometimes an anime dub can be so bad I can't watch the show. And I was like, why are dubs so bad? And I remember looking it up, and it's all the same actors. I guess they just keep using the same actors, and I'm like, no wonder I hate them, because they're using, somehow it is, the entire voiceover market got captured by this small group of people who I don't like. I don't like their voices, and I don't like the way that they act. I feel like they're bad actors. Sorry if that offends anybody, but that's what it is. Japanese culture is reserved and closed off. Yes, so they view things as multiple layers, that there's a hidden self, there's a hidden inner feelings, and then there's an outer self that you have with other people, and only gradually do those things grow closer together. And this is true of us, right? But we tend to be a little bit more just open with our feelings to try to make those deeper connections as much as possible. It's just a different culture. That's okay. Was the dub become amazing? I understand what you mean, though, better, though. So, thank you. Was the dub become amazing in the later seasons? Season 4 dub was absolutely incredible. I'll take your word for it. I've watched a few things on Social Dynamics here. There are exceptions, of course. They actually argue about sub versus dub and faithfulness in Japan. Yes, I've heard of them arguing about King of the Hill dubs and subs. They're like, no, the subtitles are more accurate for King of the Hill. You will not get the humor of America if you are listening to the dub of King of the Hill. Hey, if Amuro and Char arguing about political philosophy while shooting bazookas at each other is wrong, then I don't want to be right. They also said each other's names quite a lot. Amuro, Char, yes. So this just has to do with the way that the Japanese language is, and not anything to do with us. It's just, so a lot of times, rather than using lots of like pronouns, they'll just use names a lot instead of pronouns, right? There are pronouns like, hare, right? Like those that, right? Hare wa, those guys over there, right? But they tend to use the names a lot. It's just the way that the language is constructed, because it's, I don't know how to describe it. You take some Japanese lessons and you get really quickly that we have this kind of like a thing and a verb doing something to something else. In Japanese, it's not that way. It's a different order, right? Same thing if you take classical Latin. The function of the word is defined by the stem attached to the root of the word. That's where we get root and stem from. The root, what's the root word? It's actually from studying Latin. There's a root and a stem, and the stem tells you what the thing is doing. This is great because that means you could put the words of a Latin sentence like in any order and the sentence still functions. But when you're speaking Latin, you tend to just go your standard order that you would have for Spanish, for instance, which is like a noun, a verb, an object, and if you have an adjective, you usually just put it before the word, right? So you'd say, instead of red shoes, instead of rojos zapatos, use zapatos rojos, right? So you would do that same thing in Latin. I'm trying to think of some, puer bella, right? Like pretty woman. Yes, that's just, it's the way that people probably spoke it, but you could actually put the words in any order. It's great for poetry. I never understood why Thanos didn't just sterilize half the universe if he cared so much. Both are bad, but they both achieved the same goal without killing. Yeah. Why not a genophage? Right? Because because we start to create complex solutions. In the comic books, he just does it to impress Death herself. There's like a Lady Death. He just does it to impress a girl. So that's how it is, right? Well, why didn't he just create a genophage that if people are surrounded by more of their own species, their fertility goes down? Yeah, the Thanos justification stuff was just obviously dumb to anyone with over 80 IQ. Population doubles in like 20 years. Western pop media is 100 times dumber than most anime manga. I agree. But you have to think that most people just don't interact or think about these things. They get told them, they internalize them through propaganda, like we talked about last week, and they just don't really think about it. Like, yes, overpopulation bad. It's like, okay, have you looked at the population density of Nigeria? And they're like, it's way overpopulated. You're like, it has lower population density than Georgia. What? Yeah, Africa is it's not very population dense. It has a lot of people, but Africa's giant. Like Africa is as big as Asia. It's huge. It's gigantic continent, right? And most of the countries have fairly low population density. So you have to think like the whole Malthusian thesis of like there's a carrying capacity. People reach the carrying capacity and start to starve. He never observed that, right? Famines don't occur because people have too many children. Famines occur because something interrupts your food supply and your ability to produce food. So a famine occurs because the potatoes all go rotten, not because you had too many children. A famine occurs because there's a war that burns the fields and you don't have any crops to eat. Famine occurs because disruptive events, floods destroy the crops. A disruptive event destroys the food. That's what causes famines, classically. It's not people in an area had so many children they couldn't feed them and everyone was starving. That actually doesn't happen, right? Some people are irresponsible and have too many children, but like if we're looking at the population as a whole, that's not really what has happened classically. What tends to happen is that the limit, I mean, at least maybe in some far off future time when like we're like, I don't know, we're using 100% of every piece of soil, but like, if we're looking at the time of Robert Malthus, the problem was not carrying capacity, because if you needed to grow more food, you would just go plow another empty plot of land. Most of the land was uninhabited and empty and actually usable for different kinds of things. So you would go expand your farm, but you only would farm the amount that you could manage as an individual, and you would only try to grow the amount of food that you needed to pay your taxes and to feed your family. You weren't going to be growing extra fields worth of food just because, and how would you plow the field? You need labor to do that. Where's your labor to do that? So there's really a relationship between the labor, the amount of resources, and then the amount of food that people produce. People tend to react to these things pretty obviously. If you have more kids, then you actually have more labor to do more work. You put the kids to work on the farm, like in pre-modern societies. There were famines, but it was usually like a disruptive event. A natural disaster happened that you didn't predict, and it wiped your crops out. A war happened, and that killed the labor. The Black Death happened, and half the peasants died, and there was a labor shortage. It can get hard to make food when there's a labor shortage. Things like that. Imagine the traffic. Reminds me of how Fable 2's most moral ending was actually just picking the money. There was World War I, the Spanish flu, and World War II. Hundreds of millions dead. The population was fully recovered by 1951. What a great example. Yeah. And, there was how many people died in Russia between the Bolshevik Revolution and the mass deaths of World War II, basically just throwing bodies into Nazi machine gun fire, not caring about their lives. Like if you look at the death total between Germans and Soviets, it's like so lopsided. They were just killing their own people at a certain point, right? Yeah, I remember there was a movie, and I was like, this can't be real, and I looked it up, and it's like, yeah, this actually happened. It's like they would have a train drop soldiers off and be like, half of them would have guns, and it's like when he dies, you pick up his gun and keep shooting. So inhuman. And that's that doesn't count any of the intentional deaths and intentional famines they caused in the Soviet Union, right? Population recovered. The comic book story where he did it to impress Death because he was in love with her seemed more interesting, but I'm sure they have screwed that up too. They always use the same actors, but the only really good studios were Bang Zoom and Funimation ruined that when they started the broadcast dub initiative, so the quality's gone. I'm actually out of time. I realize I'm over an hour, so I actually need to wrap it up today. I'm not going to do a live write. I'll do a live write some other time. My kids are sick, so I can't stream the full 2 hours today, but I'm going to finish up with the chat, and I'll let y'all go. I'll plug everything, like it's all in the description box. I'll quickly plug it, the Patreon. You get free books on my Patreon. Actually, if you join now, you'll get a bunch of free books because I haven't taken them off of the membership lists. Same thing with Ko-Fi. You get the free books, and you get to join the Discord server and all that kind of fun stuff. So plug that. It's the newest stuff. I have more books coming this year. I haven't decided if I'm gonna, for the next book, if I'm gonna split it up into 3, if I'm gonna make it a trilogy or not, or just release it as a long book. Like my wallet says trilogy, you'll make more money that way. My artist says it's all one story, it should be one book, and I just like having big fat books. So I don't know, I'll make that decision here at some point. So there may be, hopefully by the end of the year, there might be anywhere between 4 and 6 books. I didn't have a super productive year last year because I was working on all this other stuff. Let's see here. Where was I? Animation. The direction they give them is also bad. All around, it's rarely done right. Yeah, the translations are bad. The localization's bad. It's a lot of bad stuff. The Time Stone could have allowed turning back time to before Thanos snapped and stopping it, but Tony insisted on keeping the last 5 years with his daughter. I'm not so good at writing. I was thinking about treating it like a D&D game, playing an imaginary campaign, then write down what happened, and that's the story. Is that a good start or dumb? I don't think you get good conflict that way. Games are games, and stories are stories. D&D is inspired by various kinds of stories, but I don't view it as a storytelling device. So I probably wouldn't do that. But you can look at the universe and that can inspire it, like with Malazan. I barely caught that you were live. Hope all's well with you. I'm doing okay. Kids are sick. I need to get off here to help my wife. If you consider going digital with some books and manga to solve your space problem, I have actually a lot of digital stuff, but I don't like it. Especially for manga, I really dislike digital manga, digital comics. I want it to be physical. I want to look at the pictures close up. I don't like digital. By the way, I finished the first draft of the Portal Fantasy Isekai novel I've been working on. Good job. Good job, Adrian. Time for the last part, editing. Yes. I would have loved if someone on the Avengers just used your exact argument against Thanos and successfully talked him down after convincing him he's wrong. Wouldn't have worked. Should have just had him want to bang death. It would have been a smart ending, but most Marvel watchers would hate that and prefer the low IQ punching and kicking to solve the problem. Yeah. Enemy at the Gates. That's the movie. Yeah. See you later. Great stream. By the way, I got your book, Water of Awakening. Thank you. It arrived today. Got tired of seeing the open tab and just bought it. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That one has morals too. Has a very strong moral frame, and there's a message that's deep hidden in those books that won't become apparent or explicit, maybe till later, but it's in there about who are you, and what are you, what are we. I'm pretty sure that's how Dragonlance and Record of Lodoss War were written, but you should ask David Stewart, he's a writer. I don't think Dragonlance is written that way, but Dragonlance is a setting that was used for D&D that a lot of people like the setting for it. Dragonlance does play a little bit like a D&D campaign, so if that's what you want, you should take a look at Dragonlance and see if that's your kind of thing. I'm not a huge fan of Dragonlance, but, it definitely has its fans and people like it that way. I would look at the stuff that inspired D&D, though. I'd look at Jack Vance. I'd look at Robert E. Howard. I'd read all these classics. Poul Anderson, right? Robert Zelazny, or Roger Zelazny, right? Yeah, that's what I'd look at. Just go further back. Water of Awakening was quite good, I thought. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. All right, guys. Thanks so much. I will talk to you all next time. I'm going to get out of here. Where is my tab? Yes, let's get some music back here. All right. Have a good one. I'll see you all next time.